So today, I'm going to be talking to you about deploying cloud security against evolving techniques and tactics. So I'm going to be focusing on a lot of what's in the news today, what's relevant, what we're seeing in the papers. So a little bit about me. My name is Jeff Stout. I'm an enterprise security architect with Akamai Technologies. I've been there for about 4 years. I actually came to Akamai through an acquisition through a company called Prolexic. Today I'm not going to be talking specifically about products or solutions per se, but I am going to highlight a couple of the things that we do see just from our intelligence and what we've collected over time. Start off with this particular slide. This is going to date me quite a bit. This is the very first security device that I ever worked with. Most in the room may know what that is, but basically that's a Bay Networks stackable switch. It's before firewalls were invented. Right? I was writing ACLs on Bay Networks and Wellfleet routers. It was right when Cisco was just getting started. Shortly thereafter, Cisco came out with the PIX. Came out with the PIX 525. Thought it was kind of funny because they called it the 525, and it also had a 5 1/4 floppy disk in it. So the 525, you actually had to boot off the floppy disk to get the iOS loaded on that device. It was like Cisco version 8. So it was quite funny. So that dates me definitely a little bit, but quite a bit has evolved since then. So that's where I'm leading with this. Why cloud security? I think that everybody here is very, very well aware what's going on in the industry. You wouldn't be here if you weren't aware of all the issues. Every single day we're seeing in the headlines, different types of vulnerabilities, different types of ransomware, different types of breaches, exposures. You just turn on the news on any channel, and it's in the paper every single day. So today I'm going to be talking a lot about application security, a little bit about DDoS security, but primarily focusing on the relevant threats, what we're seeing, what we really focused on in Q2, as well as kind of a broader landscape of what we've seen over time. This is one of the things that's really changed in the industry. It used to be predominantly, it was the IT folks, it was the operational folks that had to be aware of this. They were the ones in the trenches on the day-to-day fighting the fight. When an incident would happen, they would respond. As time has gone on, we've evolved into more and more sophisticated incident response teams. I started working with SANS years ago, about 15 years ago, and they were diligent about figuring out who on your team will respond to an incident. A lot of times, nobody knew who that was. A lot of times, you don't have the staff to do that. That becomes a very difficult challenge. Things have really changed as these are becoming more and more financially motivated. The board needs to get involved. It needs to come from the top down. We're going to see a lot of legislation and a lot of tactics coming down from the top that are mandating that you have a cybersecurity program in place, figuring out what is that incident response. The last thing that you want to do is be unprepared, because when you're ill-prepared or unprepared, everyone's running around with their hair on fire. I've been in those situations. I've been in NOCs and SOCs where it is a horrible triage incident and nobody knows what's going on. So I always speak to folks, even if you have a minimal staff, understanding who's responsible for what and when and how. And that can be difficult in itself. As time goes on, we have this notion of what is cybersecurity. Who's going to fight that fight? But the reality is it may be just one guy, maybe somebody that's been outsourced. But ultimately, we need to think about cybersecurity in a different perspective. Today, you're going to see quite a few sessions focusing on cybersecurity. You're going to see lots of charts, lots of graphs, lots of statistics out there. And yes, I will be showing some of those as well. I'm going to do my best to keep this interactive and fun and light, because sometimes these can tend to get a little bit dry. So I'll do my best to move this along. So I just want to tell a quick little story, where I was just talking about statistics. When do stats really matter? When I was a little kid, I was obsessed with this guy. I don't know if you guys know who this is. This is Fernando Valenzuela. Back in the 1980s, the Los Angeles Dodgers. I grew up in Denver, Colorado, so we didn't have a professional team at the time. There was no Rockies. So I was literally obsessed with this team, obsessed with the, what they refer to as the blind pitcher. He would throw without actually looking at the home plate. That actually blew my mind when I would watch this guy play. Well, what I'm talking about here is statistics, and when do they matter? This is the 1981 World Series. They are down 2-0. They thought the Yankees were just going to roll right through. But if you actually look at the stats of that team and actually see the combined effort of all the players on that team, how were they able to come down from a deficit of 2-0 and come back and win, become the champions, become the 1981 World Series champions? That was the greatest day of my life when I was a child. So I'll jump right into this. Q2 at a glance that we have. This is a lens and a perspective that we saw from Akamai's edge servers. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we saw in Q2 2017, just recently, versus Q2 2016. And this is very typical. This is nothing new. This isn't surprising. We're seeing a huge increase every year, year after year, more increases of attacks, more exfiltration, more deep breaches, more incidents. However, this is something that we're seeing in the industry that was a little bit surprising. This is the first time that we actually saw a decrease in DDoS events, the size of the attacks as well as the number of attacks. But what has changed in this particular slide is that the number of attacks per host. So what that means is that the attacks are happening, they're coming to your front door, but they're also coming from different vectors. They're not just launching a single attack or 2 attacks or 3 attacks. They're actually picking the different types of vectors to continue to launch against that single attack. It used to be the spray and pray technique. They would just hit everybody in the industry. Now they're becoming more focused. So it's a very interesting trend. I follow these stats over the last 10 years. And this was really the first time that we actually saw a decrease. So that was a little bit unusual to see. And just a quick look back year over year, 2017 versus supposed to say 2016 as well. Again, just an increase in the types of attacks. What still blows my mind that we see here is SQL injection attacks. SQL injection attacks are nothing new. We all hear about this. This is an attack that has been around for about 20 years. And it is still the #1 layer 7 attack that we see. SQL injection, LFI, and RFI are still the top attacks that we see year after year and increases year after year. And again, just another look back, between Q1 of this year and Q2 of 2017. Same common thread here is that we're seeing the attacks are increasing. Just a quick additional little bit of information, some of the papers that we saw over this last quarter. We did some additional research, primarily looking at HTTP2 and also what's happening with DGA. If you're not familiar with DGA, I highly suggest that you read up on that. It has become the hot topic. It's been around, again, a lot of these techniques and tactics are nothing new. It's recycled over and over again. And then I'm going to highlight a little bit about the reemergence of the P-bot. It's literally a decades-old PHP exploitation. We saw a huge uptick in that over Q2. And just going back on that broader perspective versus the finite, I'm going to focus primarily on Q2 during my talk, but looking over time, and you'll notice that back in 2010 to 2013, not a lot of DDoS attacks. The volumes weren't very significant, but as you can see, over time, not just the volume of the attack, but the density of the attacks. This is nothing new. We're seeing this happening more and more. And I was talking a little bit earlier about that P-bot. And what's unusual about that is we're seeing, rather than taking a very well-distributed, well-controlled attack and targeting at a very large campaign, the attackers have figured out, I can have a smaller botnet, but still be very effective. Like I said, we saw a decrease in the number of attacks. We saw a decrease in the volume of attacks. But what we're seeing is very finite, highly focused attacks towards specific targets. Really what happens at the end of the day, for the attackers, this is expensive. It's not free for them to launch these attacks. Very few attackers out there have botnets of hundreds or hundreds of thousands of controlled machines. What they do is they lease these out for services. It's DDoS for hire. You can easily, as just a general consumer, I can go to a site, they call them stress testers for legitimate purposes, but all I require is a credit card or some Bitcoin to launch this. But in the end, even as the bad guys try to launch these types of attacks, it costs them money. So what the bad guys have done is they're going to go after the low-hanging fruit. They're going to go after the inexpensive attacks. So rather than paying somebody to use their arsenal to launch that attack, they're going to go find out a more finite botnet that can do just as much damage. It may not have the volumes that you see of these large attacks. Those have a tendency to make the papers. The papers talking about 100 gigabits, 200 gigabits, 300, 500, 600 gigabits. There's unconfirmed rumors of terabits per second that happened last year. I believe it was very close to a terabit. Like I said, it's not completely confirmed yet, but absolutely, will we see terabits per second attacks out there? Yes, I believe so. But what's unique about this particular one, if you notice, this is what we saw through our Security Operations Center earlier this year, is that specifically for the PHP PBOT attack, these attacks weren't in the hundreds of gigabits, but very significant. And if you think about this, most companies have 1 or 2 ISP links. Those ISP links, even if they're 10 gig ports, you're only subscribed to a gig, maybe 2 gigs. So anything over what you have currently subscribed, even if you have some overflow on that, it's going to topple over the servers. It's going to topple off your entire environment. So that's why they're directing these attacks, not necessarily at these large 500, 600, 700 gigabits per second. They're figuring out it's less expensive to launch these attacks at a smaller rate. And just looking at the code when we were actually dissecting this particular attack, these are ports that are going to be open on your firewall. No one's going to block port 80. No one's going to block port 53. If you block those, basically you're offline. What they were doing here, though, with the port 53 attack was a little unusual. It was looking like it was a DNS attack, but essentially it was not. And they actually changed tactics. Rather than just using UDP, they were also using TCP. And really, why is that important? Because when they're using these type of tactics, they're evading the firewalls, they're evading IDSs, they're evading different types of solutions in place. They're finding ways around the security solutions. They're poking holes to find the weakest link in the chain. Unfortunately, what we see, though, as the attacks rise, as we see more and more and more of these attacks every single day, we've polled a lot of companies, we've talked to a lot of customers out there, and unfortunately, a lot of people don't even have cybersecurity insurance. If you're not aware of that, it's something I would highly recommend that you look into. It's becoming an industry standard. In certain industries, it's actually becoming a requirement. It's a mandate. We see it as a mandate in healthcare right now. We're also seeing it in financial services. But again, even outside those verticals, I feel it's very important, if this is something that you're not already aware of, to definitely get involved and figure out what that is. Beyond that, I think the toughest challenge that we all have is budget. Right? You only have X amount of dollars to spend per year. Is that hiring new people? Is it working on this project? Oftentimes, cybersecurity is an afterthought. It's after a breach, after an incident. One of my very first cybersecurity courses I took through SANS years and years ago, they said that the best time to ask for money is right after a breach. That's when the CFO pulls out his checkbook and starts writing those checks. It's kind of unfortunate. It's very reactionary. It's very difficult as buyers, as operators, as program managers to be proactive, to go to the board, to go to your management team and say, hey, I need money for X. The first thing they're going to say is why. And you can show slides, you can show stats, you can show all of this information, but then they're going to ask the other question, well, what has happened to us? And that's the tough question. The guys that are holding the money that are going to be asking those. And you're like, but this is a reality. This is not fictitious. Then they'll ask the question, well, have we had an incident? The answer may be no. But, at the end of the day, we need to be as proactive as possible. You know, talking a little bit about the OWASP top 10. Sometimes this is overused. I actually belong to the advisory board down in San Diego at my local OWASP chapter. I feel this is a great framework. It's not the end-all be-all for everything, but this is typically the framework that we use against application layer types of events. And again, when you look at this, the first thing that an auditor does when they come in, not necessarily a penetration auditor, but an overall audit, is they go down this list of the top 10, and they figure out, you know, where are you secure, where do you have holes, where are the weaknesses, you know, and we're seeing that most companies, it's very difficult to adhere to all top 10 because some of those are very ambiguous. A lot of it is human error. It's very difficult to actually properly configure and prepare for human error. We can do our best to train, but at the end of the day, when it comes to human error or misconfiguration, there's no machine, no tool, no service that can really help with that. So there are some of the things in the top 10 on the OWASP, like I said, that are a little ambiguous. One thing that has changed, the 2017 top 10 has come out. It's in its final revision right now. It's been ratified, and we'll see this coming out. What was unique about this is there was a brand new category and an addition to an existing category. And what are those categories? API protections. As we're seeing more and more companies out there, you know, the buzz right now is digital government. Everything needs to be digital, everything needs to be online, everything needs to be accessible to all of my third parties. How do we do that? How do we do that seamlessly? Through API access. API access is typically exposed to the public. And if it's exposed to the public, what does that do? It also exposes that to the attackers as well. So, you know, from a best practices standpoint, you know, you really need to understand what is my exposure is the first key. You know, what do I have out there as I'm moving forward? What are my plans and programs to expose APIs to third parties, to partners, to even different branches? If you've got different divisions within the company, you're no longer, you know, you can argue FTP is a form of an API, but I have a tendency to believe that people are getting away from that antiquated form of communication of just sending large files back and forth via either HTTP or FTP or some type of file upload. Everybody's going to API. So that just exposes even more data. So you need to understand, what does that program look like and how do I address that? You know, for more information about this, you know, come see me later. This is something I've been really focused on in this past year. Really understanding what the landscape is around APIs and how we can protect against that. You know, and thinking about Q2 and the different types of attacks, you know, what comes to mind? You know, duck season, rabbit season, duck season, rabbit season? No. Ransomware season. We saw more ransomware in Q2 and Q1 this year than we have. It's been around for a very long time. You know, I was doing a little bit of historical lookups on this. It's been around since the dawn of computers, you know, ultimately. And I actually even dug a little bit deeper and went back into the fact that there was actual ransomware and incidents that were happening in the telegraph age. People actually hijack and send ransom and actually take over telephone lines for communication back in the telegraph. So it's just kind of funny. This is nothing new. It's just evolved as the industry has evolved. You know, and there's tons of different types of systems out there. I'm going to focus on two types of different ransomware. Typically, there's the level of what I refer to as extortion ransomware, and then there's the typical type of ransomware where it's actually locking up your systems. And here's just a quick example over time what we've seen of the different distributions of types of ransomware. You know, we all saw this. This was the one that made the papers everywhere. It hit Europe quite a bit harder than it hit over here, but it was very effective. And this is, you know, the type is not necessarily an extortion. This is in a reactionary mode. A device has been compromised. Somebody within the organization has some infected malware on their system. I'm not going to go too much into the details of how that malware got there. There's tons of different, phishing exploits and campaigns out there. It's just kind of funny. My wife actually just got an email a couple days ago, and they've been working on this program at work. And she got this email, and it was crafted. It had everything coming from HR, had the proper name. Somebody went out to LinkedIn, got all the reconnaissance, figured this out, sent out this letter, and it says, you guys have finally been approved for your upgrade. Everyone's getting a 2.3% increase in your salary. Everybody in the office was ecstatic. She went into her manager's office and said, oh, thank you, Kim. I'm so happy. We finally got this through. We got this approved. She's like, what are you talking about? And at that point, it was too late. People were clicking on the link. There was links embedded in that email, and it was done. I don't know what happened from the exfiltration. I haven't talked to them. This happened just a few days ago, literally. But that's how these phishing campaigns come in. They don't craft them from the prince from Nigeria anymore. People don't fall for that. And a lot of programs within the company are set up to help with these phishing expeditions and help, they'll send out fake emails internally to see how many people are clicking on those links. Some of those unsophisticated type of events people are aware of. But when people are motivated about money or free happy hour or somebody's retirement party, they don't even know Bob. But Bob's throwing a retirement party. Bob works for the company. He's been there forever, so it sounds legitimate. That's free booze and free food for me. Oh, I get to click on this Google form to get a head count for that? Okay, I'll do it. Boom, done. As we all know, you've probably seen this screen, hopefully not in your company, in your organization. But essentially what it is a lockdown of your systems. It's a lockdown of your databases. This one is kind of funny if you actually read through this. If you say decrypt, it does decrypt some of the files, but not all of them. If you want all of them decrypted, then you have to pay the entire ransom. The fact that they're giving you a couple freebies I thought was kind of funny. But a lot of this is a whole other talk that I could have on around the programs and procedures to help against this. And then shortly after, what did we see? Version 2 comes out. As soon as everybody's got all their Microsoft patches and various patches for their systems, boom, version 2 hits. And, wash, rinse, repeat. Another one that we saw come up pretty predominantly was the Petra. This came in various different formats. I'm not going to go into the details on this, but again, ransomware-based. And the code itself is a very small piece of code. So, that's why they're putting them on, the buzzword is Internet of Things. This is why it was targeting, cameras, DVR systems, small home routers, baby monitors. You can implant this on any device out there. Because unfortunately, a lot of the manufacturers are just sending these out with the default username and password, and nobody changes them. The biggest shame is when people don't actually offer a UI. For instance, smart refrigerators out there. You don't have a UI to actually go in there, but there's a username and password to get into it. There's usually a Bluetooth or a Wi-Fi access for that. There's no administrative control panel to get into that, but there's a default username and password as a programmer to get in. So now I've just hacked my refrigerator's attacking me with the Petra virus. And as more and more devices out there becomes more intelligent and embedded with chips, it scares me, is what it does at the end of the day. Just a quick example, I was talking a little bit earlier about the Loki ransomware. Very common tactic. It starts with phishing, it starts with malware, it starts with that, and just exfiltrates from there. And really, the main way that once the infected system already has this on it, what is its method? Its method is to reach outbound to command and control. It doesn't have the intelligence to actually do anything. That's why it's a very small piece of code. It has to go out to the command and control center to actually get the executable code to actually run the different various techniques. It's kind of an autonomous, dumbed-down system, so it has to go home to actually get its orders. We talk about malware, and that's what we've been talking about. This is a hot topic for everybody out there. And the various different ways to bypass and how to obfuscate and get inside the company. Once it's actually on the systems, what do you do at that point? We talk about antivirus. Antivirus does a decent job, but again, they've quickly learned how to get around that. And really, what happens from a entity's perspective is limited visibility, not clearly understanding your DNS environment. Also, they're able to get around some of the tactics of, network list blocks, IP blocking, all that information. As I mentioned earlier, this is a technique that's been around for quite some time, but we're seeing a huge uptick in DGA. Essentially, the overview is that the bad guys are out there going and registering hundreds of thousands of domains on a regular basis with all the different registrars. And what they're doing is, out of 100,000, 200,000 servers, they may only employ 1 or 2 of those servers for actual command and control. But they've literally have millions at their disposal to use at any given time. So are you going to blacklist hundreds of thousands of servers? Not likely. Are you even going to know those hundreds of thousands of servers that are out there? Not likely. So you really need to have the intelligence and the lens in which to view this. What is happening in your environment? Where are your users going? Oftentimes we clamp down the users to forbidden domains. We don't want them surfing Facebook at work. We don't want them to go to YouTube. Oh, they can go to Facebook for social media, but they don't want to play games. But you're not necessarily monitoring all that DNS activity. To monitor every single click that all the users do in your environment, now you're going to have to go out and buy more storage. You're going to have to ask for more money. You're going to have to have a bigger Splunk farm. So it's really just not advantageous to do that. So most folks don't actually log what's happening at the DNS layer. They have some blacklists that they're preventing users to go to, but ultimately not really understanding what all the users are doing and where they're going. Different types of techniques out there. And again, it's all based on the same aspect. I want malware installed, and I want to bypass the controls. The DNS exfiltration, domain stopping. And I'm going to go through this pretty quick. I'm running a little bit behind on time. But how can you protect against this? Really, what you need to do is have that lens, to have your recursive DNS, to have that intelligence. Where are my users going? Are they going to domains that are human readable? If you have a domain that has a hash key value in it, or it's got ASCII code in it, it's probably not a domain most of your users are going to be going to. Your typical users are going to well-known, well-documented domains. How long has that domain been registered? What's the lifetime? Was it just registered yesterday or the day before? Well, why was it registered? Who registered it? What registrar is actually owning that? Having that intelligence and that information is key and critical, because it's almost impossible to manually go in and log, figure out everything that's happening at the DNS layer. And that's something, again, that we can help with. Come see me afterwards, come to our table, and we can discuss a little bit more about that. This is something that has been around forever, defense in depth. This is to have that multi-layer perimeter. You can't have just a single solution to solve this problem. It starts with the basics around antivirus, also, your network firewall, figuring out maybe you have a proxy in place. So everything has to filter through that proxy, so you're forcing all your traffic outbound through that proxy. And really looking at, beyond that, how do I have that intelligence? And really the intelligence needs to be actionable. Because if you can't actually do something with that intelligence, it's great to have it, but you're not actually doing anything with it. This is actually a slide that I borrowed from one of my coworkers who spoke at this event last year. We've all seen this slide, and really the uptick in credential abuse. The other term that I see is credential stuffing, password checking, account takeover. There's a bunch of different terms that we see around the internet. But why has this become so prevalent? Because it's very inexpensive to do this. You have to have zero skills to do this. Just like with the DDoS attacks, you can actually go rent this. The skilled actors that are actually creating these services are selling these services out there. And I hate to do this. I'm sure this is going to be overused all week long, or sorry, not week, all day long. Equifax, we just see this. And this is data from their site, so I'm not talking trash. This was a horrible event, but it was a reality. You look at the hundreds and hundreds of thousands, millions of records were affected. What really scared me here is it was also driver's license addresses, birth dates. This is beyond PII and PCI information. Everything's out there, including credit card information. This was a huge thing. There's going to be a lot of blowout from this one. I'm not going to focus too much on this, But it was definitely something that everybody's aware of in the news today. And here's just a quick outline of how this happens. I'm not going to run you through this entire event, but essentially the attacker is using resources, the resources that are readily available. You can blame the infrastructure as a service companies out there, all the cloud hosting environments. They've now just become an environment for the attackers to use. They're using that for reflection attacks. They're using that to install botnets. They're using it, spinning them up and tearing them down fairly quickly. Launching their attacks, getting what they need, and then getting out, taking those lists, going out to the darknet, and exfiltrating. If you're not familiar with Sentry MBA, this is probably one of the best open source tools I've ever seen written. All you have to do literally is have very minimal skills to upload a list into the system and launch an attack to basically validate, does this username and password exist? Oftentimes the password may be invalid, but if the username comes back, then we know that it's a valid account. So I'd go out and get another password list, upload it into the system, and it'll automatically run against this. But if you also look, the versions, so that's 141, 150. So they're constantly updating the versions. I like this particular one. This is 2.2, very UI friendly. You didn't even need to know much about the command line. The latest version out there is 2.5. And if you don't know how to use these tools, and here's the myriad of tools that are underneath the covers to use within that program. Well, guess what? There's help. There's help out there. There's tutorials. There's even a lot of times phone numbers you can call. You can go out to different Twitter channels and ask for help. What's ironic, though, is if you're downloading these lists and not contributing to this particular campaign, you actually get banned. So if you're downloading lists, you actually have to contribute back. So it's one of those programs that if you're just what they call gleaming or skimming, if you're a skimmer and you're skimming lists, they'll block you. They'll deny you from getting that. There's tons of YouTube videos out there, tons of channels. So, people ask, hey, I'm having a problem using this tool. Well, here's your answer. I mean, this is better than, the Geek Squad. It's better than, some of the support channels I tried to call for some problems I've had at home. I'm going to pivot a little bit and talking about, we've been talking about malware. We've been talking about ransomware. I'm going to talk a little bit about bots, because a lot of this is bot-driven. There's different types of bots out there. What I've considered the unsophisticated bots, the basic bots that are doing web scraping. Why does that matter? A lot of folks are like, I don't really care. I'm not an e-commerce company. I'm not selling anything. I don't have prices out there. So why does it really matter? One of the oldest techniques that people do is they'll scrape your website, and then they'll create a website that looks identical to yours. Absolutely to the T identical, except the URL is just slightly different. So therefore, when these campaigns happen, when they click on that link, it looks like they're actually landing on your page. And it looks totally legitimate. Now I've just entered in my username and password. Oh, password denied, but now I've gotten your credentials. So website scraping, a lot of people think, oh, that's basic crap. But it's still used every single day. And really, a lot of these tools are done via command line, via curl scripts and different PHP code. So they don't actually have to do this and go to the site to figure it out. It's very easy to gather this information. So that's what I considered more the unsophisticated bots that are out there. Another common tactic is ad click, ad fraud. Again, maybe not so predominant in this particular vertical, but we see quite a bit of that out there. But that's when we start getting into the credential abuse, figuring out how many times am I getting hit with username, password logins, how many attempts. And these guys are smart. They don't come in and just hit you with a flood of them. They'll come in and trickle very, very slow. 1, 2 times, 1, 2, 3 times, and then back off for a couple hours, 1, 2, 3, 4 times. So a lot of the systems that are in place for rate controls, various IDSs, stuff of that nature, don't catch these guys because they're not stupid. They're not coming in with a huge barrage. Yes, you do see that out there, and it's usually some college kid just screwing around. But the sophisticated guys, the guys that want this information, the guys that are smart, they know how to evade. And the ultimate goal is to get that account takeover. Because what happens at that point, they're not stealing any information. Now they can go in there, take over that account, reset the password. Now I own that account. I'm not stealing anything. I'm just going to sit there, and now I've got a channel into your systems. I've got a valid account. Now I can just go around there and start probing what I refer to as east-west traffic, figuring out what's going on the inside. And now I can essentially use a quote-unquote valid account and get more information about your company, to do that more reconnaissance. Talking about the bot problem, it's from a performance and cost perspective, one of the things that we have seen is the bots are figuring out the tactics may not be very advanced, but they're figuring out if I'm painful enough, I can essentially clog your bandwidth. I can prevent valid, legitimate users coming to your site, especially during a particular event. I see a lot of customers, especially in oil, gas, and energy. Everyone's paying their bill during certain pay periods, billing cycles. So you get an uptick in legitimate users, but you also see an uptick in bots, because the bots are in there to aggravate and actually prevent legitimate traffic from coming in. And that's just one particular tactic. We also see this, from a security perspective. It affects all aspects of the company. From a user experience, it can affect not just the performance, but also do they actually get to the environment that they need to get access to. Another thing that I've seen in some cases is that you'll see competitors out there coming into the sites, and see this again more in e-commerce, but I've seen this across the board. People are going out there and figuring out what is this city doing that we're not doing? What's this town doing that we're not doing? I don't want to go figure this out myself, so I'll just go hire a botnet and they'll figure it out for me. It's just pretty crazy, the different tactics. It also screws up your marketing. Your marketing guys actually love bots, because they can actually make it look like the bots are coming from Pinterest, coming from LinkedIn, coming from Google, and so their SEO stats go through the roof. But guess what? You've just now had to pay for all of that. But it was a bot. It wasn't an actual human being elevating your SEO stats. It was a bot. So therefore, it costs money in the background. One thing that I always talk about when it comes to bots, one of the things that you do not want to do with a bot or a bot network is block them. The moment that you identify a bot and say, hey, you're a bot and you're stopped, all it does is irritate the bot. It's like kicking a wasp's nest. They go back to command and control, and they tell all their brothers and sisters and cousins and uncles, let's go back. So they come at you even harder, even faster. Or even worse, what happens is they go back to command and control, and they say, hey, boss, they caught me, they figured me out. And what they do is they obfuscate the information even more. They start to pretending that they're coming from Microsoft, they're coming from Google, they're coming from the various different hosts that you allow into your systems. So they become more tactical. So the moment that you actually identify the bots and just block them, it causes a bigger problem. So, if you're looking at a solution, look at a solution that actually can manage the bots, not just stop and block the bots. And beyond that, talking a little bit more about the management, detection is the number one key here, and categorization, figuring out what are those bots, where are they coming from, and have the intelligence around that, and then control that, not just stop that. When I say control that, why just stop and prevent that? Maybe send them to a redirected site, send it to a honeypot, send it to a fake site, send it somewhere else. So the bot actually thinks that he did his job, and he goes home and he asks for the cookie and everything's good. Not a cyber cookie, but maybe a real cookie. But in that case, the bot's actually fooled in that particular case, and it actually helps with that particular problem. And I'd be happy to talk more about that later today. And here's just a quick example. As the bots become more and more and more sophisticated, we see this every day. Here's just a quick example of a login. As I'm going into whatever form that may be, username, password, of whatever, I can't get in. This is a typical password generator, password scanner. It's just using Sentry MBA, or maybe they're just doing this manually and going in and testing and probing. You might eventually see in your log systems a failed attempt. But again, like I said, these particular attempts are coming in low and slow. They're not coming in fast and hard. So they don't want to get locked out. So they're going to come in 1, 2, 3 times. and then back off. Usually it's 1 or 2 times. But continually, you'll see, another user tries to come on in, and again, denied. And it's very difficult to catch unless you have very sophisticated logging around that. I'll go, again, another name in there. We're just looking at more information. Again, denied. Beyond that, what can we do? If we're just looking at the username and password information, that's not enough. So beyond that, this is one of my favorite buzzwords, neuromuscular techniques. What a neuromuscular technique is the ability to figure out every single human being types differently. Some finger, 2 fingers, I call them the 2-finger bandits. I actually learned how to type. I actually had to take a typing class. It was actually my gym teacher that taught typing. I thought it was kind of weird, but I took typing for 3 years in high school. But a lot of people type with 1 finger, so everyone types fast or slow. Well, as you're typing, as you're moving your mouse, we need to figure out how we can actually gather that information. So as we're entering that information, we can collect and look at that. What's happening? How fast is this occurring? Because a botnet out there, when they enter in this information, even if they have an algorithm, it's going to be very digital. It's going to be at the same rate every single time. So it's very easy to identify that, to very quickly figure out what's happening. So if you have the ability to actually measure what's happening, not just at a login page, but let's say you're coming from one of these devices. Well, embedded in this device alone is about 52 different characteristics, gyroscope, GPS, various other techniques that you cannot turn off at the UI level that are embedded in the code of every single device. Well, what if you have the ability to actually get inside that device and actually get those statistics? That's going to tell you, is that a human being? Because even if a bot is pretending to come from an iPhone or an Android, they're saying that they're Android version X, they're not going to be able to actually figure out how that gyroscope is being moved, where their GPS location, are they mobile, are they physically jumping from tower to tower? They don't have any of that information to put into an algorithm to pretend that they're being from somebody else. So when it comes to bots, you have to have a solution that is that next layer of evolution. And really at the end of the day, it comes down to having the policies in place, having the programs in place, and oftentimes that can be the biggest challenge. And I'll just leave you with this thought, as best as possible, be proactively prepared for all security incidents instead of reactive. Oftentimes we are very, very reactive. And an incident has occurred, and at that point, I wouldn't say it's too late, but now you're in firefighting mode. So as best as possible, if we can get ahead of this, if we can get in front of this, we can do a little bit better. So that's pretty much what I had for today. If there's any questions, I can field a couple questions. We've got a little bit of time. I know I ran over a little bit late this morning, so I ran a little bit over. We've got a table out front, Akamai Technologies. Stop by. Happy to talk about everything I talked about in the slides today or any other questions that you may have. So thank you.